Exclusive games are haunting your NES. Ooh, spooky. Here's 5 reasons. Good evening. I am Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet. And this is 5 reasons. It's spooky Halloween time, so we're doing some spooky stuff. But more importantly, today is the 30th birthday of the Nintendo Entertainment System. That's right, on October 18th, 1985, the NES had a limited launch in New York City. While the Famicom had been released in 1983 in Japan, it took over 2 years to make its way to the US. Nowadays, it's common for new consoles to get near simultaneous world releases, but in the 80s and 90s, it was not out of the ordinary for Japanese systems to hit their home country a year or two before coming stateside. The American video game market famously crashed in 1983, but Nintendo revitalized it with the NES. The system originally launched with 2 controllers, Rob the Robot, the Zapper, Duck Hunt, and Gyromite. It went through many iterations, arguably the most famous being the Action Set, which included 2 controllers, a Zapper, and the Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt combo cart. Years later, the system got a redesign in the form of the NES Top Loader, famously more reliable than the original design, which would wear out from having to push the cartridge down into the system after insertion.
Batteries not included, Super Mario Bros. And other games sold separately.
When all was said and done, there were almost 800 licensed releases for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And there were more than a smattering of unlicensed carts from companies like Camerica, Color Dreams, and of course, Tengen. And a lot of these games never left the platform, and we'll be looking at more of them in future episodes. But since it's Halloween time, we are looking at 5 horror-themed games for the NES. 5 spooky reasons to own a Nintendo Entertainment System. Developer Marionette is mostly responsible for pachinko games that never left Japan, but this is one of the few action games they made. Released in 1990 and based on the Hong Kong horror comedy film Mr. Vampire, although the US release is not associated with the film at all, this game sees the player hunting Chinese hopping ghosts with their sweet kung fu moves. It includes some RPG elements and a sort of almost rhythm-based combat system. It's not a great game by any stretch, but it's very unique. Seeing the FCI logo on the cover might give you pause, but if you want a game whose looks, themes, and playstyle are unique, it's worth throwing down just a couple of bucks to take this one for a spin. Developer Sakata SAS seemed to find their niche in the 8-bit era porting arcade games to the NES for Data East. One of the few totally original games they made for the system was Werewolf: The Last Warrior, also published by Data East. This game sees the player in the shoes of a man who becomes a werewolf with blades for arms, not when there's a full moon or anything, just whenever he picks up a red W. The controls are tight, the visuals are interesting, and the game is pretty fun for the most part. Its wildly oscillating difficulty and somewhat uninspired level design keep this one from being a true classic, but I mean, how many games did you play as a werewolf with blades for arms? That alone is a great reason to pick it up. Based on the popular toy line of the day, Monster in My Pocket is a side-scroller that puts the player in the tiny shoes of either the Frankenstein monster or a vampire that's pretty clearly meant to resemble Count Dracula. The game supports 2-player simultaneous as well, so if you've got a friend, you're in luck. Coming toward the end of Konami's NES output, Monster in My Pocket came out in 1992. It's not on the level of a Contra or a Castlevania 3, but it's a solid romp and uses almost all of the monsters found in the initial toy line. And like Capcom's Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, it uses the size of the characters to inform the level design, which is pretty cool. While it's a pretty easy game, Monster in My Pocket is still a very solid late-era effort from Konami and a really enjoyable title. Fair warning, Abadox is extremely tough and kinda gross. If David Cronenberg made an NES game, he would have made Abadox. But he didn't. Natsume did. And Milton Bradley, of all people, published it in the US. Abadox is about a parasite that consumes entire planets and then sort of becomes the planet or something, I guess. The game cribs very heavily from Konami's Life Force, though it is indisputably not as good. It contains both horizontal and vertical scrolling sections, a fair number of weapons, and a ton of body horror-inspired enemies. Like I said, it's really tough, but it's a reasonably solid shooter on a system that's pretty lacking in that particular genre. Well, now I just wish David Cronenberg had made NES games. How great would Videodrome be on the NES? Long live the new Felt! And now, the piece de resistance for this episode, Monster Party. You've no doubt at least heard of this game. It's an extremely bizarre side-scroller that came out only in the US in 1989. The story involves a young boy named Mark being approached by a good monster named Bert to come back to his world and help defeat all the evil monsters running amok there. The game is basically a boss rush with a ton of weirdness. I mean, there are side-scrolling sections, but there's a ton of bosses in each stage and they all have to be defeated. Some bosses are references to movies and whatnot, and some are just weird for weird's sake. This game is the kind of bizarre stuff that we just don't get on consoles anymore, and it's definitely worth picking up to check out. Monster Party is not what you would call good in the traditional sense. The difficulty is unbalanced, it's got glitches all over the place, and some of the level design is, well, it's downright bad. But it's so odd and so charming that it begs to be played. And well, that brings our first Halloween episode of 5 Reasons to a close. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you get a chance to let these 5 games possess your NES this season. I'm Roger the Retro Gaming Puppet, and we'll see you next time.
What will the future bring from Nintendo? More hits like Super Mario Brothers. Arcade hits like Kung Fu. Nintendo has the most video game hits. Hogan's Alley, Duck Hunt, and more like baseball and Excite-Bike. And you can play them only on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.